Hi, I'm Chet Swearinger with the Revival Ministry, Beautiful Feet. And this is the third video in our series titled Principles of Revival. And in this video, we're going to be covering the revival principles number 4 and number 5. So the number 4 principle, the fourth principle of revival is faith to believe revival is possible. So we have all this extraordinary prayer that is taking place, but prayer that doesn't really mean anything if it isn't linked to an assurance or faith that what you are praying for is actually going to take place. Like when Jesus said in Mark chapter 11, verse 24, "Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you will receive them and you will have them." So just getting together and praying isn't going to change anything if we're not really believing that it's actually going to happen. Now, sometimes it might be the proper thing to do to get together and to pray for revival, but to actually believe that a revival will happen is another step that has to be taken. It is a principle of revival. So this question must be asked then. If revival is being prayed for, do we really believe it will happen? In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, it says, "But without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him." I believe that God wants to reward us with His presence and with His blessings. And I believe that He wants us to be revived. That is a promise of His. That is His will for His people to live in a perpetual revived state. Jesus also said in John chapter 11, verse 40, when Jesus responded, He said, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" So there has to be an element of faith attached to our prayers. Our prayers mean absolutely nothing. Now, there was this missionary, his name is Jonathan Goforth, and he served in Manchuria, up in northern east part of Canada, and he was the foremost, or not Canada, but in the east part of China and in Manchuria in 1908, and he was the foremost missionary revivalist in the early 20th century China, and he experienced powerful revivals for years. And he said, "There has never been a revival except where there have been Christian men and women thoroughly believing in and wholeheartedly pleading the promises of God." So you believe it's going to happen, and you're pleading in prayer, asking God to send His promised revival blessing. Now, I know in the United States we have what we refer to as unity services, and they're become a tradition. Most communities, they conduct these unity services several times a year, sometimes maybe on Good Friday, maybe at Thanksgiving time, and that's good that those services are conducted. It's beneficial for a community, but nobody truly expects anything to come from them other than an opportunity to be friendly with people from other churches. There's no expectation of a real revival to happen from them. And what I have found is that is common when communities get together to pray for revival. Many united efforts in praying for revival have become like the traditional unity service, in that the revival prayer gatherings are a nice display of unity. But when prayers offered during such events, if they're not backed up by means or efforts, or as the Apostle James would say, works, all those prayers, they won't amount to anything. I don't discount, I'm not putting down the effort to unite communities together for prayer. I'm not saying that at all. But if there is not something behind the prayer, some kind of step, some principle of revival that you are putting into place to see this, what you're praying for happen, then all the prayers aren't going to amount to anything. Faith works. Faith does something. And so when you're praying and you're exercising faith, it leads you to take steps of faith to see whatever it is you're praying for happen. James chapter 2, verse 26 says, "For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." So faith without works is dead. If a community is genuinely serious about pursuing God for revival, you will see them not uniting a couple times for unity services. You will find them implementing revival principles, these revival principles that we are talking about. So, what about you? After you watch all of our revival or principles of revival videos, and then you're going to be faced with a decision. And the first decision that you're going to be faced with is, will I implement these principles in my own life? And the second decision you're going to have is, will I use my influence to encourage others to do the same? That is revival principle number 4, believing what you're praying for. There has to be that faith involved. Now let's look at revival principle number 5, which is planned revival services. Now we just finished looking at revival principle number 4, faith to believe that a revival is possible. And we learned that if there really is faith, then there will be action to confirm that that faith is real. Yet we find some that assume that revivals rest solely on the sovereignty of God, and there is nothing that humans can do to change that. And this inclines some to just sit and wait for the revival to come. And they think that there's nothing they can do to help initiate its revival. It's like it's all dependent on God. But from the study of our many revivals, we have learned that revivals have never just fallen out of the sky. Not a single revival has just fallen upon a particular congregation without them doing something first to see it initiated. There was an initiator, somebody that set the spark. There was extraordinary prayer. There was people that were believing that their prayers were going to be answered. There was a pastor that was behind it, supporting it and helping to drive it with his sermons. There was a movement, and everybody was engaged to see it happen. There have always been intentional efforts by individuals and congregations prior to a revival's appearance. It never just falls out of the sky. The most common intentional human effort that has led to many revivals has been prayer, and following that, it is the scheduling of special services over several days. We sometimes are referred to as protracted services. And this was a series of services conducted every night, lasting from 7 days, maybe up to 14 days long. And I know that many people believe and view those revival services like that as being an outdated practice. Yet from the study of revivals, all these revivals that we have seen take place down through the years, it appears that this is one of the principles that was used to bring the fire down, having these services scheduled. So this was not a method that was used, this was a principle that was applied. It was like a law that was put into place to see the revival happen. So you wonder, why were these services so effective when they would conduct these services lasting maybe 3 or 4 or 5 days or maybe a week long and sometimes longer? Why were they so effective? And here's some of the reasons why these extended services over a period of time were so effective. One, people did not come to these services expecting the routine. They were exercising faith that something different would occur. So leading up to this protracted series of services over maybe a week long, the congregation was fasting, they were praying, the pastor was preaching sermons on revival, building people's faith up to believe for what they're praying for. And then, being out of the routine of the weekly church service, people's anticipation levels were elevated, enhancing their faith that God would truly manifest His presence. God works on the basis of faith, and sometimes we have to do things to build people's faith up. So, number 2, God's promises are actuated by faith. Some people's faith takes time to build, and with multiple services in a row, time is given for that faith to build in some individuals. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have the first night, and there's maybe a small crowd that comes out. Maybe the church is half full. Well, God does something phenomenal that night, and testimonies are coming forward. And then they tell their friends during the next morning, the next afternoon, and it stimulates faith and encouragement. So a few more people start trickling into the church service. And then that night, on the second night, there's testimonies that are given, and it instills faith and inspires people. And then the third day, there's more people people to come. So that is how revivals generate power and force over several days long. It's the building of faith. Also, the third thing why these services were effective was because revivalists or evangelists were used or utilized for preaching during the services, as they had a unique gift that most pastors do not have. Now, this isn't saying anything against the pastors. It's just that we all have different gifts. We have different abilities. So pastors have their special and unique gift, one in which the revivalist or the evangelist cannot compare, and that is in maintaining, comforting, and shepherding a congregation. If you know a real pastor, their best gift is to bring comfort to people's lives, to see maintenance of a congregation, to provide that sheltering care. That's what pastors do best. But that unique gift, with that unique gift and special calling, pastors are not always the best to be used in leading their flocks out of the comfort zone and into revival, because revival is an area where it's not comfortable. The pastor's gift is to provide comfort, to shelter, and to maintain it a steady flow. And that isn't what revival is. So sometimes an individual with that gift of a revivalist or an evangelist has to come along and to allow the Holy Spirit to work through them. Now, almost all the revivals we have studied and written on, there's been over 53 by the spring of 2020, and we have found that a series of church services were used to initiate almost every single one of them. So, what about you? Has your congregation ever considered scheduling revival services? Are you and your congregation so desperate for revival that you would fast and pray and then attend the scheduled services? Maybe for 1 month or 2 months, fasting and praying at different intervals in anticipation for these specially scheduled services where an individual would come in to speak. And that would boost people's faith and cause them to believe and to be able to reach up to God. Something out of the ordinary. Begin now by asking God if He would have your congregation consider scheduling special services. So please keep watching these video series on principles of revival. We want revival to happen in your life, in your family, in your congregation, community, and throughout the tri-state area of Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio, and as far as the Lord desires to take it. So there's 4 more principles of revival we still have to look at.